On the 22nd of June 1941, German troops in Poland near the Soviet border got the green light to undergo one of the most amphibious operations in history, Operation Barbarossa. The Soviets were unprepared and taken back. Although initially very successful, it would soon spell the doom of the German Reich at the Battle of Stalingrad. To fully understand this brutal battle, it is impossible to overlook the bigger picture and not talk about the larger Operation Barbarossa which preceded it. Before World War II, Germany and the USSR, although having opposing ideologies, soon found strategically beneficial to ally. They signed many research treaties in which Germany gave the Soviets valuable technologies in exchange for the crucial Caucasian oil. In 1939, the two superpowers signed the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Both countries agreed not to fight each other. This new alliance, brewing between the ideologically extremists, is a shock to the Western allies of France and the United Kingdom. Both countries also secretly agreed to split Poland in two. When World War II starts, the two countries follow through on their deal. Eastern Poland belongs to the USSR and West to Germany. Joseph Stalin, communist leader of the Soviet Union, knows an invasion is coming. However, to him, Germany will not attack Russia until it is done with its Western enemies. It's a perfectly logical assumption, but one that will prove wrong. Meanwhile, in the West, Germany blitzkriegs its way into France and the French forces surrender. Unfortunately, the British don't follow suit, and much of the German attention is focused on protecting their coastal regions from the dreaded British Royal Navy. There's no chance an invasion of Russia is coming, Stalin thinks to himself. Who'd be crazy enough to do that? Many people today criticize Stalin's train of thought here, but that's because we have hindsight. By this point, there is no evidence of an imminent invasion of the Soviet Union. The Germans are focused on knocking out Britain. By 1941, in German high command, an operation was already underway. Operation Barbarossa, they called it. German troops had started amassing on the Soviet border. However, to keep the operation a secret, the soldiers were not told about the plans. Even some of the senior commanders were unaware of what was happening until hours beforehand. Meanwhile, in Moscow, few suspect such plans. Just a few reports from British intelligence about Nazi plans made to invade the USSR, but Stalin, blinded by a mistrust of the British, dismisses these reports. Reports of soldiers amassing on the Soviet border with Germany are also dismissed. There is nothing to worry about. Now, one misconception that spreads a lot is that the Soviets had no troops on the German border and the Soviets had not mobilized in the slightest. Although their unpreparedness played a major role in the initial German success, it's false to say that the Soviets had just been sitting ducks. After all, a major war had broken out between the European powers. The Soviets had to get prepared for a possible war. In fact, the Soviets knew a German invasion was coming. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf his desire to end communism in Russia and exterminate the Slavic people. However, what Stalin and the rest of the Soviet high command had failed to see was just how great Hitler's desire was. They didn't get the if wrong, and they got the when wrong. Reports of Stalin's meeting with ministers showcased that by 1941, the USSR would be prepared for war by 1945, even though Stalin urged for a faster mobilization plan of the Soviet army. In such circumstances, at the beginning of 1941, Stalin had enacted a defense plan 1941 along with a mobilization plan 1941, nicknamed DP-41 and MP-41 respectively, in order to prepare for an inevitable invasion. Little did they know how close that invasion was. On the 22nd of June 1941, the inevitable did come, just not as expected. The full force of the German army hit Russia. In just days, the German army rushed through eastern Poland. Stalin is devastated. He suffers a mental breakdown and locks himself in his room. The Russian high command scrambles to thwart Soviet resistance and defensive maneuvers. The German army, meanwhile, pieces through the small Russian troops that are near the border. This is where we see the German blitzkrieg at its finest. Encirclement after encirclement. The Soviet troops were captured in the millions. At Minsk, 450,000 Soviet troops are encircled, and another 500,000 at Kiev. By the end of July, the northern section of the German army entered Smolensk. They are now 400 kilometers or 248 miles away from Moscow. By August, over months after the invasion, the Germans were on the outskirts of Leningrad, a full 700 kilometers or 434 miles away from the initial border pre-invasion. The Germans get ever so closer to Moscow. However, by December 1941, the lightning movement had bogged down and the Germans made slow advance towards Moscow. This is mainly where the story of the German winter comes in, and how Germany couldn't get to Moscow because winter set in. However, as misfortunate or unlucky that might sound, the reality, as usual, is a lot more nuanced and less as clean-cut. Although the advance on Moscow could make an episode of its own, the quickest way I can put it, there were multiple factors that caused the German to slow down, of which the Russian winter plays a small role. In fact, it is believed that the myth of the Russian winter comes mainly from the Nazi propaganda, spread around by Hitler himself, who used it to justify their defeat to Russian troops, a tale of misfortune to parallel himself to Napoleon's defeat, a way of undermining the Nazis' own lack of preparation and foresight regarding this invasion. The real main factors were rain, and therefore mud, which slowed any form of motorized or tank offensive, huge Soviet meat shield defenses, scorched earth, which led to massive supply issues, and an overstretched front. By spring, it was clear to Hitler that his army was in a desperate need of supplies to beat the Soviet Union. Although infrastructure projects were well underway, there was a problem. Germany did not have the required material to supply its troops, and in this context, its machinery. Even if Hitler took Moscow, it would not help him win the war. Most factories had been moved further east behind the Moscow line. With this in mind, Hitler began to turn his attention south, to the Caucasus, a mountain range in between the Black and Caspian Sea. It would have skipped Hitler's attention if it wasn't for one key detail: oil. The Caucasus had an abundance of petroleum oil that could help supply the entirety of German forces in the east. However, Hitler knew this region would be heavily defended with Soviet troops. He needed to be able to take the oil fields while not being attacked by waves of Russian reinforcements. Known as Operation Edelweiss, or Case Blue in English, this was an operation which split the army in two. One German force would try to push their way to the Caspian Sea, cutting off Soviet supply in the region, while a second army pushed south towards the oil field. This plan would require the Germans to seize a strategic river known as the Volga River, which ran through a particular city which immediately caught Hitler's attention, a major city in the region known as Stalingrad. Not only was it a crucial city for further offensives in the east, but it bore Stalin's name. This wasn't just a strategic target, it was an ideological one too. The German forces, which consisted mainly of the German 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army, were tasked with this important mission. They were led by General Friedrich Paulus, who lacked quite a lot of field experience, but had been crucial in the preparations for Operation Barbarossa. In total, the forces numbered 270,000 men. Initially, Stalingrad was only meant as a secondary aim, the Caucasus being the first. In fact, the city was only chosen for strategic convenience, as it was situated between the Volga and the Don River. Field Marshal Kleitz, who had been named Commander-in-Chief of Case Blue, even said after the war that Stalingrad was used because it was to protect the German flanks in the Caucasus region. I tell you this because it helps you understand some of the initial strategic decisions made by the Germans. On the other side of the front, the Soviet defenses had been set up in the region, consisted of the Soviet 28th, 51st, 62nd, and 64th Army. And before you get confused here, the only one that's important to our story is the Russian 62nd Army. Although this defense might sound elevated compared to the German 6th Army, the Soviet forces numbered around only 190,000 men compared to Germany's 270,000 men. As a side note, for those interested, the reason the Soviets had less forces in the initial offensive was because they thought the Germans would start an offensive on Moscow, and so had deployed a large part of their forces there. And so, in July of 1942, Operation Case Blue went into full effect. With the help of the Luftwaffe in the air, and thanks to German blitzkrieg strategy, the Germans made staggering progress. Despite suspicions on the Soviet high command about a southern offensive, the actual hit was quite devastating. However, with the lack of organization of Soviet troops, there were plans in the Russian army to retreat back and set more defensive lines in the Caucasus. To the Germans, this could be devastating, because as stupid as it might sound, the biggest enemy to blitzkrieg is retreat. With no troop to overrun, the German offensive would have been for nothing if it wasn't for overstretching the supply line even more, and having to face well-prepared, well-defended lines of Soviet soldiers. That's why a few days into the offensive, part of the 4th Panzer Army set for Stalingrad was redirected south to block any Soviet strategic retreat and to fully overrun the enemy forces. However, this left the German 6th Army, still under General Paulus, to attack Stalingrad on its own. And the Germans put their full attention into encircling the Soviets in the Caucasus before making their way south, and it's possible the story of this podcast could be very different. But again, hindsight is everything. As the Germans grew closer to the city, they soon found themselves facing fanatical defenses from Soviet soldiers. This is because on the 28th of July 1942, Stalin sent out the infamous and historical Order 227 that Soviet soldiers would take to heart and to their grave for a bloody and grueling 5 months. No step back. However, and I have said this word quite a lot, despite this stiff defense, the German army thanks to partially to the help of the Luftwaffe, pushed the Soviets back, even making breakthroughs into the city and the Volga River. From then on, the offensive was slow and steady. General Georgy Zhukov made a few breakthrough attempts, and although they were repelled by the Luftwaffe, they managed to hold down the German lines. On the southern side of the city, the Germans made headways on the Volga River, forcing Soviet troops to be supplied via unreliable boats on the river, which would get regularly bombed by German air power. Despite the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe in the early days of the battle, their role soon became obsolete as Soviet troops began, as Commander Vasily Chirikov put it, hugging tactic on the German forces, getting close to enemy soldiers and fighting in brutal close-range combat. These tactics proved effective in repelling attempts by the Luftwaffe to support their ground forces through aerial bombardment, as the risk of German casualties in the bombing was too high. The downside of this strategy is infamous. Urban combat, which made Stalingrad famous, engulfed the city. Every street, every house, every room was fought to the bitter end. And yet despite all of this, the Germans continued on, managing to capture a strategic hill overlooking the city and closing up on the Soviet forces. However, counter-offensives meant they soon lost the heights. This back and forth between Soviet and German forces was omnipresent throughout this battle, with areas as small as singular buildings regularly changing hands or being defended for days despite being behind enemy lines, like Pavlov's house or the grain elevator, which was held up by 30 Soviet soldiers for 3 full days. Much attention had been brought to the south of Stalingrad, but by the end of September, German offensive began focusing on the northern part of the city, which was the industrial sector. After a slow advance, the Germans arrived in a heavily fortified area, which consisted of the 3 main factories: the Red October steel factory, the Varikadi arms factory, and Stalingrad's tractor factory. Soon after, the defenses led by the Soviet 62nd Army were pushed back and the Germans made headway, reaching the Volga River inside the city in October. In the air, the Luftwaffe gained clear air superiority in Stalingrad, as much of the air as possible had been sent to the battle, which the Germans paid a heavy price was the lack of air force in the Caucasus region. Despite the Germans' air superiority though, they were unable to help the troops on the ground as the Soviets continued to hug the Germans. On the Soviet side, their hold on Stalingrad was left to mere small pockets holding on the remaining areas along the Volga River. Luckily, Russian reinforcements began to arrive via the river in October, complicating matters for the Germans even more. However, among all of this chaos, winter began to set in Stalingrad, as a result, the battle reached its most gruesome phase. The river began freezing. In Stalingrad, battles slowed down as the cold air of winter made the Germans unprepared for renewed offensives. Yet fighting quickly engulfed the city as the Soviets drew up their winter counter-offensives. In the north, the Soviets pushed back and recaptured strategic areas in the industrial sector, although this was just a distraction for events to come. Dubbed Project Uranus and led by General Georgy Zhukov, this was the Soviet plan for their winter counter-offensives, and hopefully to bring an end to the costly battle. The basic aim was to encircle and wipe out the German forces in Stalingrad in a move that very much resembled the German blitzkrieg tactics of the first phase of Operation Barbarossa. This plan was quite smart. The Germans had focused all of their resources and troops into taking Stalingrad, and they had not bothered to put up good defenses along their flanks, thinking the Don River, which ran through the area, would provide a natural barrier to the Soviets. As such, these areas along the north and south of Stalingrad were protected by Romanian and Hungarian forces, who were under-equipped, under-trained, and weren't in a position to fight. Even in a defensive spot like this one, Soviet tanks breezed through Romanian defenses on the river, and the breakthrough attempt was successful, encircling a total of 220,000 to 300,000 German soldiers in the city. From then on, the Soviets continued west, draining any hope of Axis relief forces. Friedrich Paulus, head of the Sixth Army, and subsequently encircled himself by this offensive, was tasked with this precarious dilemma. Does he surrender? Does he attempt a breakthrough? Or does he hold on? After the encirclement, German forces in the south that had not been encircled were reorganized into Army Group Don, mainly consisting of the remnants of the 4th Panzer Army, which had initially been diverted away from Stalingrad, and were placed under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. It was Manstein that advised Hitler not to order the 6th Army to try and break through, thinking he could relieve the forces himself in Operation Winter Storm. By this point, the idea of supplying the 6th Army through planes were considered, and was actually used. However, the project was too extreme, as the Luftwaffe did not have the capacity to supply an entire army made up of hundreds of thousands of men. In the city, the soldiers began to starve. Even with supply planes flying over, they were only supplied with ammunition and fuel, but no food. Medical equipment was scarce and the injured were unable to receive proper medical attention. Manstein, on his side, still believed a relief attempt was possible from his position. The Sixth Army was told to keep their position while the Germans attempted to break them free. At its best, the German forces made it 48 kilometers away from Stalingrad. However, the Soviets, sensing German weakness and a massive opportunity, began an ambitious follow-up offensive nicknamed Operation Little Saturn, which attacked the Germans on their northern flanks while at the same time pushing them further away from the Caucasus in the south, ultimately risking a potential secondary encirclement of German forces in the event of relief. This, and the Germans unwilling to order an all-out breakthrough from the German Sixth Army, meant the relief attempt was a failure. By January, the Germans scraped every food they could get. They were still waiting for that relief force they had been told about. Numerous surrender attempts were given to Paulus, but to no avail. Paulus, although desperate, believed in his superior's assurance that relief was coming. However, by the end of January, relief was falling apart. The Soviets once again made surrender offers to the Germans. Paulus then called Hitler, describing to him the desperate situation. His men had no food, no water, and he begged Hitler to be allowed to accept the surrender deal. Hitler refused, stating that the Germans in Stalingrad should fight to the last cartridge, and there were none left but the last man. Hitler even proposed that Paulus commit suicide in order not to surrender to the Soviets, but Paulus refused. He was a Catholic. A few days later, Paulus is promoted by Hitler himself the Generalfeldmarschall, or Field Marshal. Yet this was no promotion. It was a call to arms. No field marshal in the history of Germany had ever surrendered. To be the first would be a humiliation. On the 31st of January, Paulus' headquarters in Stalingrad was overrun by Soviet forces. His command had set themselves up in an abandoned department store. Paulus himself was captured, the first time in history a field marshal had ever surrendered. Even then, the Germans still held out. The southern part of the city was now cut off from the north. Although the south soon collapsed thereafter, the north held on. However, on the 2nd of February 1943, General Strecker, the de facto general of the Sixth Army after Paulus' surrender, learned that all of his advisors had deserted to negotiate a surrender with Soviet forces. Strecker, seeing that all hope was lost, although never ordered his men to surrender, heavily implied they should, for their own sake, while he followed suit. Helmut Grossgrove, chief of staff of Strecker, sent a final message to Berlin, telling them about the surrender and replacing the usual formalities of Heil Hitler with Long Live Germany, a sign of resistance and, in my view, a symbolic gesture of the turning tide of the war. Most soldiers surrendered, a few kept resisting, not out of any sort of fanaticism by any account. Simply put, these were Germans scared of Soviet reprisal. Stalingrad is undeniably the bloodiest and the deadliest battle in history. Although casualties are hard to calculate because of the sheer brutality of the battle, most of my sources didn't agree on how many Germans were encircled by Operation Uranus. German casualties sit around an estimated 800,000 men, while Soviets lie around 1.1 million. Stalingrad would signal a beginning of a new phase in World War II, one where the initial German speed was not enough to turn the tide in their favour, one where power and sheer industry defined the word victory. Nazi Germany would, in a sense, succumb to its wound at Stalingrad, a memory of the most brutal battle in history.